Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. On behalf of Bard Graduate Center founder and director Susan Weber, I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program, which brings together two remarkable partnerships. One is the creative and complex relationship between Alfred Morrison, a fascinating patron and collector of the Victorian period, and Owen Jones, the brilliant architect and designer whose ideas shaped how the 19th century basically thought about color, pattern, and ornament. The other partnership, of course, is that of our speakers, Caroline Dakers and Neil Burton. Um, they are partners in life and in scholarship, a combination which might test the limits of either pursuit, but in their case seems to only have enriched both. Alfred Morrison, as you will soon learn, was among the 19th century's most discerning and perhaps most discreet collectors, filling his homes with paintings and sculpture and extraordinary objects commissioned from leading European craftsmen. But how Morris displayed these treasures is where Owen Jones comes into the picture. His designs for furniture and interior architectural details were executed by a preeminent London cabinet maker called Jackson and Graham. And to be honest, the few things that I've seen from these commissions are absolutely stunning. They are truly next level in terms of their materials and their workmanship. So I guess what I'm saying is not only will we be seeing some really, really beautiful things here tonight, but the story has all the makings of a good drama. It's got excessive wealth, it's got obsession, it's got a lot of male ego, and of course it has the art. So we are fortunate to have cultural historian Caroline Dakers, Professor Emerita of the University of the Arts, London, and Neil Burton, Director of the Architectural History Practice here tonight to guide us through this fascinating story. Together, they have thought deeply and published extensively on the intertwined worlds of art, architecture, design, and patronage, worlds that Morrison and Jones inhabited so vividly. And tonight, we also celebrate the publication of Caroline's new book, Millionaire Shopping, The Collections of Alfred Morrison. Please welcome our speakers.
So thank you very much for a lovely introduction. So the UCL Press publication, Millionaire Shopping, The Collections of Alfred Morrison, has been put together by 17 contributors, scholars in Britain and America, and each an expert in one or more of Alfred's interests. Some are here tonight, and I must begin by thanking all of them for assisting in a considerable undertaking. Some of their work informs my and Neil's presentations. So we've done a bit of plundering from their research. And also thank you to the Bard Graduate Centre for hosting this event. Tonight, Neil and I will be discussing two important Victorian figures, the very rich landowner and collector Alfred Morrison and Owen Jones, one of the most important designers of the mid-19th century. With Alfred's wealth and Jones' imagination, they created extraordinary colour-filled and multi-patterned interiors in Alfred's London and country houses, both furnished with striking carpets, wall coverings and furniture. I shall begin with Alfred Morrison. Neil will follow with Owen Jones, and then we'll talk a little more informally about their reputations and really trying to answer the question, why aren't they better known now? Alfred inherited the Fonthill Park estate in Wiltshire from his father James Morrison, who was a successful textile merchant, a radical MP, a landowner, a collector, and a major investor in the infrastructure of the United States. When he died in 1857, he was recognised as the richest commoner in Britain, leaving a fortune then of over £4 million. The pavilion, renamed Fonthill House by Alfred, was the surviving wing of Alderman William Beckford's Palladian mansion, Fonthill Splendens. The main part of the house was demolished by Beckford's son William, while he was building his astonishing Fonthill Abbey. In 1846, James Morrison had commissioned the architect David Brandon to turn the modest pavilion into a country house appropriate for a wealthy bachelor like Alfred. One of his obituaries described Alfred as a man of high cultivation and an accomplished Maecenas in London. At the same time in Wiltshire, the obituary said he was a model squire and a perfect country gentleman. I think it is important to realise that all the time he was building up his collections, he was also improving his estate, building cottages, improving the quality of his livestock, and maintaining a very large stable of hunters and thoroughbred horses. And you'll see that his love of animals, domestic and wild, spilled over into aspects of his collecting. Although Alfred's annual income was extremely high, several £1 million by today's values, he chose not to compete with the range with collectors like Sir Richard Wallace when it came to old masters. As with all his range of collections, he was unwilling to spend very large amounts on just one item. His preference was always for quantity. This also applied to his patronage of particular artists and craftsmen. He wanted everything they produced. Most of his old masters were portraits of famous men and women, a theme, perhaps an obsession, which crossed over to his collections of engraved portraits, coins and medals, and autograph manuscripts. This undoubtedly linked to his sense of self, his place in society. His father, after all, had been born in a country inn and apprenticed as a young man to a haberdasher. So this portrait of Queen Henrietta Maria, the widow of Charles II, was probably the first of his acquisitions, and it was bought in 1852, shortly before his father died. Provenance also mattered to Alfred. Thus, this portrait by Bronzino appealed particularly to him. It was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, himself a collector as well as a great leader, to be hung in the Museum of Paolo Giovio on Lake Como. It remained with the Giovio family until 1860, when it was sold to Prince Napoleon Jerome Bonaparte, residing in the Palais Royal in Paris, and then Claridge's Hotel in London. Marseille Middleton Holloway, Alfred's favourite dealer, who operated out of Covent Garden in the 1860s and 70s, acquired it for Alfred in 1872 for £341 6s. The early portrait of Elizabeth I may have been in the Esterhazy collection before being acquired by Alfred, and is now believed to be by George Gower, Elizabeth I's sergeant painter. From 1860, Marseille Middleton Holloway, the dealer, and his son helped locate engraved portraits for Alfred, in particular by Hogarth, Dürer and Rembrandt. They also produced the first of Alfred's catalogues in 1868 of almost 3,000 engravings. Alfred not only catalogued some of his collections, throughout his life he lent to exhibitions in Britain and in Europe paintings, sculpture, coins and medals, pieces by Charles Lepec and Placido Zuloaga, and furniture by Owen Jones, and some of those designers won prizes at international exhibitions, which really was a result of his pushing forward their work. He also welcomed scholars into his home to study particular items. This was especially true of his growing collection of autograph letters. The Holloways located items in the 1860s and 70s, and by the 1880s he was relying on a dealer called Alphonse Thibodeau to locate and to catalogue. By Alfred's death, he owned some 7,000 individual items, including this sheet of Leonardo da Vinci's, the letters of Jane Austen to her sister Cassandra, and the very last letter written by Mary Queen of Scots before she was executed. I imagine Alfred spending time at his desk, handling, studying, carefully cleaning the many small items he acquired. This tiny Etruscan scarab depicts Ajax approaching Cassandra, crouching beside a statue of Athena. Cassandra is nude, apart from a mantle wrapped around her legs. Ajax, who is about to rape her, wears a crested Attic helmet and carries a shield with the head of Medusa on the blazon. And all this is really only visible with a magnifying glass or just about blown up on the screen. And when it was sold in 2019 at Christie's in New York, it reached $237,000. This is something. And the medal is extremely rare, the very first coronation medal of any English royal. And it was struck by the Tower Mint in 1547 to mark the coronation of King Edward VI. Alfred was fairly conservative in his taste in contemporary art. He liked land and seascapes, paintings and sculptures of animals, both domestic and wild. He bought mostly from the Royal Academy, so much so that he was invited to their prestigious annual banquets. Some artists became close friends, and he bought almost everything they produced. John Brett became a friend in 1864, when Alfred paid 250 guineas for a painting which had a £250 price tag. And Brett wrote to him, "Hitherto, I have found people mostly forget what a guinea means and pay £1 instead. But you, on the contrary, have sent me guineas when I only asked pounds." Alfred acquired about 30 of his paintings. And for those of you who don't know, a guinea is £1 and 1 shilling. So if you're adding it, turning it into £600, then those extra guineas, the shillings, are quite a bit. Summer Moon by Frederick Leighton is more unusual, the only example, I believe, of an aesthetic movement painting in Alfred's collection, bought at the Royal Academy in 1872. But Alfred did also have a particular taste for images of women, clothed and unclothed. And Leighton was president of the Royal Academy. And the poor quality of the slide is because this is from a reproduction in a magazine. The painting has never been seen since it was sold in 1920 to the famous Indian cricketer Ranjit Singh, the Maharaja of Nawanagar, and is believed to be somewhere in the family's palace in India. Alfred was unusual in collecting paintings by contemporary American artists. He had travelled extensively in North America in the 1840s on behalf of his father's merchant bank. And in letters home, he marvelled at the colour of the trees in the fall on a trip up the Hudson by steamboat to the Catskill Mountains. Here's one of a number of paintings he acquired by the Hudson River School artist Jasper Cropsey, undoubtedly as a memorial of his visits to the States. Though also an American, Hiram Powers kept a very large studio in Florence, where he employed 6 carvers working full-time to deliver reproductions of his works to England, including many versions of the Greek slave and Proserpine. The 2 busts that you can see here, when sold by Alfred's widow Mabel in 1899, were described as modesty and chastity. Alfred's collection of Chinese porcelain was exceptional. The provenance is now a subject of enormous sensitivity, as the majority of pieces were brought to London and Paris after the looting of the Summer Palace in Beijing in 1860. Alfred bought a large quantity in about 1861 and was immediately hooked. The colours, the patterns, the extraordinary craftsmanship and their history all appealed. Over the next 5 years, he spent some £40,000, about 2 million in today's values, buying hundreds more pieces, mostly through the dealer Durlacher in Bond Street. And a visitor to Fonthill in 1864 found the house filled with Chinese porcelain, quote, cabinets jammed full of it, such a collection, in short, as never was seen and never can be anywhere else. The 1862 International Exhibition, held in Hyde Park, was a key event for Alfred. A 6-page shopping list drawn up for Alfred by the jeweller Robert Phillips survives in the archives at Fonthill and reveals the bewildering range of objects he acquired: paintings, sculpture, ceramics, textiles, objets d'art, furniture, from all over the world. He spent over £7,500, or about £500,000 in today's values, on his shopping spree. Most importantly, the exhibition introduced him to the French enamelist Charles Lepec, the furniture makers Jackson and Graham, and probably the Spanish Damascene craftsman Placido Zuloaga. Alfred was never limited by borders. At the exhibition, he bought a large number of items from India: textiles, boxes, rugs, and fine watercolours, including this example. He also bought paintings by Russians, Norwegian, and Belgian artists. The shopping list includes very large and very small items. Antoine Louis Barye was the greatest French animalia sculptor of the day. The full-size bronze version of his sculpture Theseus and the Centaur cost Alfred £250 and was placed on the lawn in front of Fonthill House. And Alfred was eventually to own another 5 smaller bronzes by Barye, all of animals. This pattern occurs again and again, of buying more and more by somebody that he was very, very keen on. And the much smaller bronze of a bull and bear fighting is by Isidore Bonheur, brother of the much better known artist Rosa Bonheur. Alfred acquired a sculpture of a bull by Rosa herself. And he later bought small bronze pieces by the animalia sculptor Julius Heinrich Harnell, including a giraffe, a dromedary camel, an ostrich frightened by a lizard, and a group of hippopotamuses. And these were displayed throughout Fonthill and Alfred's London house on mantelpieces and on tops of chests. Both Barye and Harnell are, like John Brett, examples of artists taken up by Alfred. He was unable to resist owning numerous pieces by them, indeed in some cases owning the largest collections of their works in Britain. I mentioned those women, clothed and unclothed, which he seemed to fall for. It was Robert Phillips, the jeweller, who introduced Alfred to the French enamelist Charles Lepec, who was showing a number of pieces at the International Exhibition, and they became close friends, so much so that Alfred named a bedroom at Fonthill House Lepec. And Lepec was to receive commissions from Alfred for the next quarter of a century. And some of his work is now in the Metropolitan Museum. It is most likely that Alfred was introduced to the expert in Damascene work, the Spaniard Placido Zuloaga, soon after the exhibition. Once again, Alfred established himself as the major patron of his favourite craftsman, eventually owning some 30 pieces, ranging from the top Fracane to this enormous cassone. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Damascene work, it is the technique that involves inlaying gold, silver and other metals into an iron surface, creating an intricate decorative effect. So the cassone here was 9 feet long, it weighed a ton, and when the critic from the Magazine of Art saw it in London, he commented it was to be gazed at. To use it would entail much trouble on the user. As with Zuloaga's cassone, size was a draw for Alfred, particularly when linked to fine craftsmanship. And this cabinet by Foudenoir was 8 feet high, the most expensive item bought by Alfred at the International Exhibition, costing him £1,400, or perhaps £100,000 in today's values. The most significant aspect of the International Exhibition was the renewing of a family connection with Owen Jones. Alfred's father, James Morrison, had commissioned him to design a dairy house for Fonthill, which was never built. but Alfred lent the design to the International Exhibition. Seeking a solution displaying these hundreds and hundreds of pieces of Chinese porcelain led Alfred to commission Jackson and Graham. He bought a cabinet by them at the exhibition with their designer Owen Jones. The display cabinets are of ebony inlaid with ivory. The Chinese porcelain was displayed against a background of yellow silk. Alfred's initials A.M. were inlaid in ivory on the lower parts of each of the cabinets. A.M. would appear on many of Alfred's commissions, even on the firebacks to his house in London. By the early 1860s, Alfred had established his interests across an extraordinary range: Chinese porcelain, engraved portraits, old masters, contemporary paintings and sculpture, enamelled objects of virtue, autographed manuscripts, coins and medals, all being acquired at the same time. He didn't move from one collection onto the next. He bought all at the same time. He rarely sold anything in his life. For the next 30 years, he went on acquiring more and more of the same. It was hardly surprising that he had serious space issues at Fonthill. A few display cabinets by Owen Jones were hardly sufficient. Consequently, in 1863, he applied for a lease to 16 Carlton House Terrace in London's prestigious St James's area, and he let loose Owen Jones on the interior. And this house became one of the most extraordinary palaces of art in the capital. And I now pass on to Neil.
Good evening. Right, well, I'll get to Carlton House Terrace eventually, but not immediately, because I'm going to introduce you to Owen Jones, who I think is, as we've already heard a bit, one of the most important design influencers of the 19th century in Britain. His full claim to fame is a bit too much for me to cover in 20 minutes, so I'm going to concentrate on his public reputation by 1862, when he was commissioned to work at Fonthill, and on the work he did for Alfred Morrison. And if you need to know more about Owen Jones, there's a very good book by Carol Flores published in 2006, which is much fuller. So, another portrait of Owen Jones. Jones was a Londoner. He was born in Thames Street in the City of London in 1809, and he lived most of his adult life at 9 Argyle Place, which is just south of Oxford Circus in the very centre of London. He trained as an architect in the office of Louis Volumy between 1825 and 1830, and then travelled in Europe and the Middle East between 1830 and 1834. In 1831, in Athens, he met and befriended a young French architect named Jules Goury, who was with a young German architect, Gottfried Semper, inspecting the classical ruins with a particular eye for traces of structural colour. This was a time when, in France in particular, there was a great sort of interest in whether in classical antiquity statues and buildings had been painted in colour. Jones and Goury then travelled around the Mediterranean together for 2 years, spending time in Egypt and Istanbul, measuring and drawing buildings, and they ended up camping for 6 months in the ruins of the Alhambra Palace in southern Spain, measuring the palace ruins and sketching the Islamic decoration. Goury died of cholera in 1834, and Jones returned to England and spent much of the next decade working up their joint studies for publication. He couldn't find any printers with the necessary skill in colour reproduction, so he studied extensively chromolithography, so he could oversee publication himself of high-quality coloured images. And he went on to have a whole alternative career as a designer of illustrated books, which I'm not going to cover here. So between 1842 and 1845, Jones issued his plans, elevations, sections and details and sketches of the Alhambra, first in instalments and then as bound volumes. The books named both Jones and Goury as the authors, and the text was in both English and French. Publication was very widely admired. I think it made a financial loss, but it was very widely admired, largely because of the spectacular coloured plates. And it established Jones's reputation as an expert in Islamic art, and he was generally nicknamed Alhambra Jones. And in fact, just going back to this portrait done of him in 1856, the background of the portrait is actually the wall decoration, a section of the wall decoration in the Alhambra, with glazed tiles below and patterned decoration above. In the later 1840s, he worked mainly as an interior decorator, and one example of his work at this time is this interior of the Church of St Bartholomew, Sutton Waldron in Dorset, where in 1847 he decorated the interior of a new Gothic revival church by an architect called George Alexander, who'd been one of the subscribers to his book on the Alhambra. Now, it's a very minor work, but it has interest because it's one of only 2 painted interiors by Jones which still survives in the world. And although you probably can't see very closely, although it looks as if it's conventional medievalizing Gothic decoration, it actually uses Islamic motifs in a Gothic context with a great deal of colour. On the basis of his work at the Alhambra, Jones formulated elaborate theories of design and the use of colour, drawing largely on the theories of George Field, a chemist who published a book on chromatography and a treatise on colours in 1835. And his theories were introduced to the wider public, Jones's theories that is, when he was asked to decorate the interior of the 1851 Great Exhibition building. As I expect you all know, the exhibition was the first ever international exhibition of its kind in Britain. It was a magnificent display of manufactured products, from steam engines to exotic goods from Britain and its colonies and beyond. A temporary crystal palace of glass and iron was built in Hyde Park to house the displays, and Queen Victoria and Prince Albert presided over the grand opening ceremony. And this is the interior of the exhibition building. Jones's simple yet radical paint scheme utilised only the primary colours, blue, red and yellow. The exterior of the building was painted blue and white, while internally, what you're looking at here, the ironwork was mainly blue with red on the lower surfaces. The iron columns were painted in vertical stripes of blue and white and yellow. There was a huge amount of controversy about the colour scheme, lots and lots of alternatives, colour schemes, lots of abusive articles in the press. But after a sample bit had been done and approved by Prince Albert, public opinion turned and the building scheme was generally acclaimed. 6 million people, 3 times the population of London at that time, visited the Iron and Glass Palace, and which established Jones's national reputation as a colourist. Now, this is a view of which Jones, well, he's credited as one of the authors. He didn't actually do it. So I've put it up to show the colour scheme, but it doesn't, the colours have faded. This is part of the problem with sort of mid-19th century reproductions. So I'm not sure that it gives a very good picture. Everybody commented about how the blue ironwork made the perspective in the distance, made it seem even larger than it was. And anyway, very successful. I'm just saying that, even if you can't see it. After the Great Exhibition closed, the building was bought by a group of businessmen. It was taken down and re-erected on an even larger scale at Sydenham in South London. The structure was again painted in colours under Jones's direction. The new building included a series of historic courts to show off the architecture and design of past ages. Jones provided the colour schemes for these as well, and he designed the Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Alhambra and modern sculpture courts, while across the aisle were the Byzantine, medieval, Italian and Renaissance courts by Jones's close friend Matthew Digby Wyatt. And they were all highly coloured. And there's a bit of the Alhambra court on the right-hand side. Within the iron and glass frames of the main building, the courts were made of painted plaster, with plaster replicas of historic architectural features and statues, not always to scale. So I think it must have been a rather bizarre experience to go into these courts where there was, for example, a great mock-up of the Abu Simnal temple in Egypt, but only to half scale. So you gave you a completely distorted idea of what these things looked like in reality. My mention of plaster is a cue to introduce Leonard Alexandre de Sacchi, a Parisian plasterer who almost certainly met Jones when he and Matthew Digby Wyatt were arranging for casts to be taken of antiquities in the Louvre to install them in the Crystal Palace. De Sacchi carried out this work and came to London to assist in the assembly of the casts. Perhaps more importantly, he's credited with the invention of a material called fibrous plaster, which made the spectacular interiors of many of Jones's later buildings possible. In 1856, de Sacchi took out a British patent for producing architectural mouldings, ornaments and other works of art formed with surfaces of plaster. The process involved making up a mixture of plaster, oil and glue, strengthened with sheets of coarse hessian and pressed into moulds, and the moulded sections could then be fixed into position with the help of wires embedded in the canvas, and the finished mouldings could easily be painted in colour. It was an entirely modern material, much lighter and much cheaper than traditional lime plaster. And it's an illustration of the fact that Jones was committed to the idea of a modern architecture using modern materials, and he used de Sacchi's invention extensively, as we shall see. In the same year that de Sacchi got his patent, 1856, Owen Jones brought out The Grammar of Ornament, the work for which he's best known. It contained 32 propositions or rules on the forms of design and the use of colours in architecture. It also contained 20 essays by Jones and others on various historical styles, and 100 chromo-lithographed plates illustrating 1,000 examples of ornament from all over the world. And here are two of the sample plates from The Grammar of Ornament. His propositions, these 32 propositions, were immensely influential on his contemporaries and on later designers. And the examples he gave, like these on the screen, were a treasure trove of motifs and colours, which are still being used as a resource for designers. And I think I'm right in saying that The Grammar of Ornament, in various versions, has never been out of print since 1856. The propositions were also taken up by Jones's friend Henry Cole, the first director of what is now the V&A Museum in London, and they were incorporated into the curriculum of the National Schools of Design. By the 1880s, there were 177 of these schools of design in Britain, all full of students, and all the schools teaching the South Kensington method of drawing and copying, largely based on Jones's designs. And just to illustrate the kind of significance of that influence, 177 schools of design at the time, and there are 4 universities in England. So, hugely more students are being subjected to Jones's really rather kind of heavyweight propositions than were studying whatever it was, the classics. At the end of the 1850s, Owen Jones designed 3 very public buildings in central London, which celebrated the use of new materials and the use of colour. In 1857, Jones, who had many musical friends, including the music publishers William Chappell and Thomas Beale, was commissioned to design St James's Hall, a concert hall on an enclosed site with frontages to Piccadilly and Regent Street. Within a brick shell, which you see here, the whole of the framework of the main building was of iron, made by a firm called Kennard Brothers, iron masters, iron merchants and consulting engineers. The main hall had a spectacular curved ceiling of iron ribs clothed in Dassaki's fibrous plaster and painted in the primary colours of red, blue, white and yellow or gold. And the room was lit by a host of small star-shaped gasoliers, so it produced a sparkling effect. And for 50 years, from its opening in 1858 until its demolition in 1905, this was one of London's premier concert halls. A second project at about the same time was something called the Crystal Palace Bazaar, an iron and glass galleria for the exhibition and sale of goods of the most elegant description on a site just off Oxford Circus. Again, the fibrous plaster of the ceiling with its glazed coloured panels was by Dassaki, and the ironwork was by this firm Kennards, who also provided the financial backing for the project. A third and similar London project of the late 1850s, which I'm not showing you a picture of, I'm afraid, was a showroom for Osler's, the prestigious glassware manufacturer at 76 Oxford Street. Behind a sober street front was a long display gallery, apparently constructed of timber rather than iron, with a ceiling containing stained glass in geometric panels of fibrous plaster like those used in the Crystal Palace Bazaar. The side walls were lined with mirrors, the fibrous plaster work by Dassaki, and the fittings were made by the firm of Jackson and Graham. So these three buildings, all open to the public, all with spectacular interiors and all in the very centre of London, cemented Jones's reputation as a master of decoration and display, an apostle of colour and an advocate of modern building techniques. And in two of them, he was also associated with the upmarket furnishers Jackson and Graham. So in 1860, Dassaki returned to Paris, and Thomas Kennard, Jones's particular friend in the Kennard family, came to New York as chief engineer of the Atlantic and Great Western Railway. And in 1864, he built himself an elaborate mansion on Long Island, designed by Jacob Ray Mould, a pupil of Jones, who'd emigrated to the States. But that's another story. At the 1862 exhibition, as you heard, Morrison purchased lots of elaborate pieces of furniture made by Jackson and Graham, and then commissioned them to make some elaborate shelving to show off his newly acquired collection of Chinese porcelain at Fonthill House. Here's a view of the house with some of Alfred's collection of Chinese pots dimly visible through the conservatory windows here at the bottom left. Jones was evidently bowled over by Alfred's porcelain collection, which reversed his earlier low opinion of Chinese design. I mean, he'd really written some incredibly rude comments about Chinese design in the Grammar of Ornament, saying that, Chinese design was inferior to the lowest terracotta production of pots on the Nile. It was quite unbelievable. He didn't like it at all. But he said that the Fonthill collection, quote, opened his mind to a new world of ideas with regard to colouring as practised in decorative art. Apparently he used Chinese-inspired colours for the decoration of the walls at Fonthill. We don't know anything about that because there's no record of them. And more significantly, he published in 1867 his book Examples of Chinese Ornament, selected from objects in the South Kensington Museum and other collections. And it's a book which is always overshadowed by the Grammar of Ornament, but it shows Jones moving away from his rigid ideas about colour and his idea that everything's got to be red, yellow and blue, towards a more inclusive approach, which is apparent in his later works. And of these, the most important was Morrison's London house, 16 Carlton House Terrace, overlooking the Mall, looking to Buckingham Palace. Okay, and Alfred's house is this one, with the skylights in the roof. It was a brand new house, built in 1864 to finish off a terrace originally designed 30 years earlier by John Nash. And Jones was apparently given a free hand and an open checkbook to decorate the interior. The shell of the house was built under the supervision of a rather obscure architect called James Murray, and his specification for the interior is utterly conventional. But the interior, as designed by Jones, was anything but. On plan, it was a conventional large London terrace house, but all of the 7 main rooms on the ground and first floors were given highly coloured Moorish ceilings made of fibrous plaster, with carpets woven to reflect the ceilings, walls lined with coloured Lyons silk patterned to designs by Jones, often with curtains to match, and doors and fittings in elaborate, expensive, exotic timbers with inlay decoration. Many of the rooms also had inlaid furniture made by Jackson and Graham to Jones's designs, as well as paintings and opulent objects from Alfred's collection, about what we've heard. The colours were very different from those used in earlier buildings, with less use of the primary colours and more use of secondary colours like purple, pink, orange, green and amber. For example, the first floor drawing room had 2 elaborate ceilings, a triple frieze coloured red and gold, blue and red and gold and blue. The walls were hung with silk in a sweet pale hue of pinky grey, and the carpets echoed the pattern of the ceiling. At either end of the room were elaborate chimney pieces with over-mantel mirrors flanked by pilasters with brass inlay. One of the chimney pieces, this one here, had highly coloured enamel decoration by Lepec, and apparently took 2 years to build. And the furniture included an inlaid cabinet, an inlaid grand piano to Jones's designs, and various items of Damascene ironwork by Zuluaga. This is the interior of the room. I think I'm not sure. The house has now been bought by one of the richest Indian sort of millionaires in Britain, and been entirely redecorated. So wall coverings and even the paint schemes, I say this is by Owen Jones, but mostly by Owen Jones. The library had gold and green silk hangings on the walls, glazed ebony glass-fronted cases to dado height all round, and the cases had marquetry decoration and were filled with books and treasures, including silver and yellow work by Tiffany and Japanese netsuke. So here we've got, this is the Lepec chimney piece, so French enamel, and then on the far side is one of the cabinets in what was called the library. It didn't seem to have many books in it, but full of treasures. And in the middle is a detail of one of the doors. I can't remember offhand which room, but you can see virtually every surface had high quality marquetry in it. The house was finally finished in 1870. Owen Jones died in 1874. A fortnight later, Alfred hosted a meeting with Jones's friends and professional colleagues to decide how to perpetuate his memory. The outcome was a mosaic portrait in the Kensington Valhalla, which was a series of portraits of titans of the fine and applied arts in the south and east courts of what is now the V&A Museum. There was also to be a travelling scholarship at the Royal Institute of British Architects and an exhibition of Jones's work, which was duly held at South Kensington later in 1874. Sadly, the mosaic has now been lost, whatever that means. And what I'm showing you here is the design for the mosaic. And the travelling scholarship at the RIBA seems to have ended in the 1930s. So, to sum up, Alfred Morrison was an obsessive, very rich and very significant collector who loved colour and glitter. He was naturally drawn to Owen Jones, who was the designer of some spectacular interiors, all using vibrant colour. Most of Alfred's collections are now dispersed, and he's hardly known. Jones, an immensely important figure in Victorian design. I would say as important as Augustus Pugin or as William Morris. But apart from the grammar of ornament, which clings on to consciousness, he's also little known or regarded. Partly, I suspect, because hardly any of his buildings still survive. And I leave you with a picture of the drawing room of Carlton House Terrace in about 1930, by which time all the ceilings had been painted white. All the colour had gone, the walls, all the silk had gone from the walls, the carpets had gone, and the walls were lined with old tapestries for somebody else's taste. The house, as I've said, has now been partly restored in an immensely lavish way, but the immersive colour experience which Jones designed for his friend and major patron Alfred Morrison is sadly lost forever. Thank you.
Must explain, UCL Press publishes all their books online for free. So it's freely downloadable. You do not have to buy the book. If you want to buy the book, you go onto the UCL Press site, you push a button, you give them lots of money, and the book is delivered to you hardback or paperback. But if you go online, you can actually click on the images, you can make them larger, you can search across images, you can search across the index. So, and of course, UCL Press books are now available right round the world for scholars for free. So we think it's an admirable way now of publishing scholarship. Okay. So a plug for UCL Press. Okay, so I'm going to kick off by asking Neil to just say a little bit more about what happened to Owen Jones's houses, his projects, leading to him really disappearing from our sort of sense of, you know, the great designers of the 19th century. So over to you. And you have to use the...
Yeah, sorry. Okay, well, I suppose I'll start with the simple thing, which is just to continue what I was saying before. One of the sad things about Owen Jones is that his buildings have an appalling survival rate. The St James's Hall was demolished in 1905 to make way for the Piccadilly Hotel at Piccadilly Circus. The Crystal Palace Bazaar was pulled down in 1890. Osler's, the glassware place, in 1928. And really, I suppose the saddest loss was in 1936, the Crystal Palace, which was full of these highly coloured casts, burnt down in a very famous and spectacular fire. And so there really only are two buildings surviving out of James's not enormous oeuvre, I must say. And one is that funny little church in Dorset, and one is Carlton House Terrace, where there's the ceilings and marquetry survive, but where it is, as a multi-millionaire's house, an immensely private place, so people don't get to see it. So that is one problem about his reputation. I think another consideration about Owen Jones is that an awful lot of his work he did as a kind of design advisor to commercial firms. I mean, he was a design advisor to this firm called Minton's, who made tiles to his design. He was a design advisor to a firm called Warner's, who produced wallpapers. And he did the same kind of thing for Jackson and Graham. And of course, all their products, I mean, Minton's products are billed as Minton's. Warner's are billed as Warner's wallpapers. So there was no kind of recognisable sort of name tag to go with them saying Owen Jones.
So that's completely different to Morris, where there's this label of Morris and Company that kicks off in the 1870s and has carried on. Yeah. And even Sandersons, who own the Morris patents, sell them as Morrison Company.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
so he lost his name in that way.
he did. Yes. I mean, I think Owen Jones has also been a kind of casualty of what you might call historiography. That's to say, in the 20th century, and the 21st century, I suppose. I was reading Nicholas Pevsner's Pioneers of Modern Design book, this kind of classic text, which starts the pioneer of the sort of founding pioneer of modern design is William Morris, and everything stems from that. But I mean, at the time, in the 1870s and 80s, there wasn't so much to choose between those two. I mean, Morris was using quite a lot of the design theories which were in Owen Jones's propositions. But obviously, with people like Pevsner saying Morris is the founder, and also with Sanderson's, the textile manufacturers in England in, I think, the 1960s, suddenly producing lots and lots of Morris fabrics. Everybody knows about William Morris, and no one knows about Owen Jones. Oh, and there's one other thing which I have to say. One always hesitates to bring religion into these subjects, but I think it's quite interesting. Jones was clearly what we would call an atheist. He thought that all great works of creativity were driven by religion, but he thought that the Christian religion had had its day, and that the modern religion was, no, I can't remember, I wrote it down, science, commerce, and industry. And so that earned him a lot of enemies. And the other thing, which is quite interesting, is I'm not quite sure if it came out, that Jones was completely convinced that Islamic decoration was incredibly important and a really, foundation design stream. Whereas Ruskin, another major critic a bit earlier, absolutely did not see that and did not like the kind of Islamic approach to design. So how much these things matter in reputation at the time or now, I don't know. But they're all elements in the melting pot. So now, why don't we know about Alfred Morrison? What happened to his collections?
So I think the Alfred Morrison story is much more about personalities. So Alfred made a big mistake when he married a much younger woman, 27 years younger, Mabel, in 1866. And he'd already amassed this great collections, if you like. He'd already started to fill the Carlton House Terrace with all these objects. The house being the interior all done by Owen Jones. And then he got the wife and brought her in to his collections. And when he married her, he made a will in which he assumed there might be some children. I think the assumption is, he wanted children to inherit his collection, of course. But he made this will and he left almost everything to Mabel with some money to children if they came along. And he asked her to create a list of heirlooms that his collections will be looked at and things will be drawn out of them as heirlooms and they'd be labelled and numbered. And those things will be kept at Fonthill House forever. He never changed his will. He never made his own collection list of heirlooms. So when he died, first of all, I think Mabel and there were 4 children, had not enjoyed living in Carlton House Terrace with 16 servants, all moving around in this house completely full of stuff. And the decision was made to sell the house by all of them. Mabel did not want to stay in that house in London. She got another house and she downsized to 13 servants. That was one thing that happened. With the heirlooms, the executors for Alfred were his 2 brothers, Charles and Walter, and they actually commented in the letter survives that they didn't really know how to select from these enormous collections. And so they got Mr. Tom Cox from Christie's to come along and draw up the heirlooms list. So, what happened? The heirlooms contained the Chinese porcelain, the coins and medals, the old masters, some bits by Zuluaga. It did not include any contemporary works of paintings or sculpture. It did not include the 7,000 individual items of autographed manuscripts. It did not include most of the works by Charles Lepec. It did not include furniture by Owen Jones, apart from those ebony cabinets at Fonthill. They were not in the heirlooms. And as you can imagine, what happened is that those items were gradually sold off as soon as Alfred died. I mean, there were death duties to be paid, some money had to be raised, but the family chose not to stay in Carlton House Terrace and not to keep major parts of the collections. And we can only assume, and this is where the archive is really slight. I mean, Owen Jones has no archive at all. No, which is another problem for Owen Jones.
A single scrap of paper about Owen Jones's work for Alfred Morrison at Carlton House Terrace. There's no bills, there's no correspondence, nothing. But we have to assume that Alfred Morrison said, "Fine, go ahead, money they want."
Yeah. So the archive for Fonthill and for the Morrison family is also slight, and things are missing. And we just assume they didn't like all these objects that Alfred had collected.
Yes.
How
many sales were there within 10 years?
22 sales at Christie's between about 1898 and 1906. Okay.
So that's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff, and if you look at the catalogues which do survive, you can see how much. But it's about the taste of the next generation of Mabel being so much younger. She, by the way, lived for another 36 years and moved out to another house. That was another problem. She did cling on in Fonthill House for a while, forcing the eldest son, who hadn't inherited that house, because of course the will had been written before he was born and the stuff had been left to Mabel. He was forced to build another house on the Fonthill estate, moved out there. He didn't like the old house, and when his mother moved out, they demolished Fonthill House. So that house, which has been the interior design, and we know lots of the work in interiors by Owen Jones, has gone. When you get to the 1970s, 60s and 70s, the next generation, two down of Morrisons, are hit by major taxation. And then there's another raft of sales, something like 30 sales, again across 10 years, of the remaining collections of Alfred Morrison. The Morrisons keep their land. They keep the villages, they keep the investments, they get rid of the objects. And I think that's where taste comes in, which I think links with Owen Jones. That, the 20th century, looking at some of those objects, just went, ugh, all that glitter, all that heavyweight furniture, all those big pieces, they weren't valued.
I think you have to mention the Pierpont Morgan opportunity.
Oh yes, so I don't want to demonise Mabel, but one can't help but do it. So in about 1903, I think it is, Sotheby's had sold a few of the autographed manuscripts, and then they came to Mabel with an offer from Pierpont Morgan of, I think it was about £200,000, millions at that time, to buy all the autographed manuscripts. And she said, "No, I'm not selling it for 200. I want 250,000." So Pierpont Morgan walked away. And
it could all have come to the States. The whole thing could all be in Pierpont Morgan.
Yeah. And then in the First World War, Mabel decided she did need the money, and so she put them up for auction through Sotheby's, several sales. She didn't get 200,000. She got nothing like it, and those sales dispersed the autographed manuscripts. So though some are here in the Morgan Library, they're also in the British Library, they're scattered around the world. So there's a sort of mixture of taste and maybe greed, and also the family, the Morrisons, was nothing like, if you know Richard Wallace, the Wallace collection. Richard Wallace, when he died, left everything to his widow. They had no children. So it was the one house in London, Hertford House, and she made the decision to leave it all together and give it to the nation, to Britain. The Morrisons, they had kids. They wanted the millions. They wanted the investments. They wanted the land. They didn't want the objects. And so it's sort of a sad tale. But if you go to the Metropolitan Museum, there is this amazing clock, which is designed by Felice for Alfred Morrison. It's a table clock, so it's about this high. It's in the Dakers of the Met, and it's a Gothic clock with ALM on the side. It's completely encrusted with gold, silver, rubies on the roof, enamel work. It is the most extraordinary piece, which we've only just seen because we've only just seen pictures. And in fact, Danielle from the Met has written a chapter all about it. Quite an extraordinary piece. And it was sold, I think, in the 1930s out of the Morrison collection for about £65. And it's completely with beyond value. Extraordinary piece. So, all right, we're going to stop now and ask you if you've got any questions.
Is that clock in the British rooms at the Met?
It's in the decorative arts department, European decorative arts at the Met.
Okay, thank you.
19th century galleries.
Thank you.
Yeah. Behind you and then it comes.
Thank you. This was great. Number 16. I don't know if you can put the last slide on. It appears to have a Crown property tag, but I think you said it was privately owned now? The Crown Estate?
Yeah, it was. Obviously, I mean, it's built on the site of the Prince Regent's Carlton House
Yes.
Palace, and so it was a Crown Estate property until relatively recently. In fact, number 16 was in the 1970s and 80s the office of the Crown Estate, which is the agency.
Because the Queen Mother lived practically next door, didn't she?
Practically next door, but it is now sold to the Hinduja brothers, together with the houses on either side.
Gosh.
And they now own the freehold.
Thank you.
Another question right here.
We believe they paid about 90 million for the houses. And then the houses. And then pounds, sorry, 90 million pounds. And then they spent another 90 million doing them up. And they've been very kind in allowing us to come in and take some photographs of the scene.
Mine's sort of a twofold question. The first was, with Owen Jones, there's people like Dresser who had design studios, and then certain artists who worked with Dresser went on and had their own career. Does anybody know, did Owen Jones work as a studio, or was he more of a singular designer?
He had an architect's office.
Mm-hmm.
He did practice as an architect at his house in Argyle Place, because that chap, Philip Ray Mould, who designed the Kennard House on Long Island, worked in Owen Jones's office as a trainee architect. But in terms of design, I don't think he had anything. Well, there's never been any mention of anything you might call a studio, and I think it may be that in some cases, and I'm just theorising, that Jones did that kind of design work in the premises of the commercial companies that he was working for, because certainly Jackson and Graham, they were cabinet makers, but they supplied everything, anything for the interior. Their works were about 5 minutes walk from Owen Jones's office and an architect's office. So, he might well have done the designing there, but I don't think there's any evidence he had a kind of design studio.
And I just wondered, how well known were the interiors in the 19th century?
Well, I think the interiors were probably well known. I think it's an open question whether people would have thought this is a wonderful interior by Owen Jones. I mean, there were commercial premises. I mean, when you go into a shop, it may be the work of some wonderful interior designer, but you don't necessarily know who they are. Unlike, let's say, Morris and Company working in private houses where the identity of the designer is all part of the value of the design. So, I mean, Owen Jones, I think, was pretty well known as a design theorist in the 19th century, but I'm not quite clear what his public reputation was.
Can I just add in that the Carlton House Terrace was only written up in about 3 places, Magazine of Art, another couple of publications, and only around sort of 1879, 1881 too, and never again. And photographs were not taken of the inside of Carlton House Terrace ever in the 19th century.
No idea.
At Fonthill House, photographs, it was never written up. It was never sort of visited, by sort of people interested in design or Magazine of Art, anything like that. So Alfred Morrison, although he allowed people to come and see his collections, although he sent stuff out to exhibitions, and although he had things catalogued, he didn't seem to want the sort of art critics at the time, design critics, to come in and write him up. And so if you look online, look at the book, you'll see that in the 1890s, 1891, a few years before Alfred died, he applied to the Crown Estate in London to see if he could have 3 new galleries stuck right on top of his house, because he had no more space. And they refused, because they were the leaseholders, the ground leaseholders. And so he built 3 galleries at Fonthill at the back. And we do have photographs of those, black and white, but black and white, unfortunately. But that is the only evidence. There's sort of 7 photographs of really what any of the displays look like. So the book has been quite a challenge to sort of put together this idea of what they were doing. And it adds to Owen Jones's low reputation as well as Alfred Morrison's.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you both, and I'm going to take full advantage and ask a question to each of you. The first question is regarding Mr. Morrison. I want to assure you that some of us do know him, but perhaps through a roundabout way. As you know, in less than a week, it's going to be the 220th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And I think you probably know, Mr. Morrison was a collector of Nelson letters. And in that sense, I would say that I would also highlight that I think he performed a very important role in terms of actual being a scholar or scholarship, because his collection of letters were I think the authoritative collection of Nelson letters for quite some time. They've been superseded perhaps lately, but so I just wanted to ask you on the Morrison side where his interest, because he had quite an extensive collection of Nelson letters, and we're talking about Admiral Lord Nelson, and whether it was connected to Fonthill, because Nelson and Lady Hamilton had been to Fonthill, and the connection with Sir William Hamilton and so on. So that's anything related to Nelson. That's one question. The second question, I'll give them both so you have, is in view of the fact that Mr. Ruskin was not a fan of Mr. Jones, and we know that Mr. Whistler was not a fan of Mr. Ruskin. I wonder, are there any Whistler connections in that Jones arena?
Gosh, well, I fear the short answer is no, but that is a mind-boggling idea. I'm not sure, really. I mean, Jones was very much an advocate for what you might think of as a fairly rigid design approach, designing on the grid or on a diagonal or something like that, and not at all in favour of blurred edges or impressionistic images. I mean, he liked, with the Great Exhibition, using colour to create a particular kind of atmosphere. But it was all based on a very rigid theory. Convex surfaces should be painted yellow, concave surfaces should be painted blue, straight surfaces should be painted red, and totally inflexible. I can't see him bonding with Whistler in any significant way.
Yeah, and I don't know whether Alfred Morrison ever visited or knew or visited Leyland's house, which would be the famous peacock room, which is the same era across. So if you compare them, they really are so different. And Alfred did put up that later painting. I think it's the aesthetic painting. So that wasn't really his
Can we talk about you like black? You like black furniture? I mean, he had aesthetic elements, but not blue and white porcelain.
No blue and white porcelain, but not much at all. It was the multicolour porcelain. With your question, two things. First, yes, absolutely Fonthill Abbey. I mean, Alfred, I didn't really talk about this, but I think Alfred saw himself as a bit of an heir to William Beckford. I mean, he didn't own the ruins of Fonthill Abbey, but they were walkable from his estate, and he knew the owners. Marquis of Westminster. He bought pieces of William Beckford, so he was seeing himself as close to that. But he also was completely obsessed about the great hood. So his engraved portraits, his autograph manuscripts, his coins and medals, they were all about great men, great women, architects, leaders, actresses, So he would have wanted to own those letters because Nelson was the great British hero.
But he wasn't. Am I right that he wasn't that keen on Napoleon?
I think.
Is that right?
He didn't do that sort of. Some British collectors collected the sort of Napoleon stuff. I think there's some letters, but not like this. He chose sides. Yeah, he chose sides. Yeah, but I mean, you're right. The manuscripts, I think, are better known as coming from his collection by people who work in the area of autograph manuscripts. And of course, he produced, I think it's 13 catalogues, and he transcribed all the letters, and he had translated all the letters in French and Italian. And he could also speak fluent French and Italian, but he did a great service to scholars. So, yeah.
Yes, I wonder if you could recommend a really good book on Owen Jones' work for Minton's.
I don't know there is one, actually. I mean,
I know I design tiles, and I know that there are a lot of books on antique tiles, but I have never seen that they separate out the ones that Owen Jones did.
Well, I think I would start with Carol Flores' book on Owen Jones, which has got pretty hefty sections on his design, interior design work and work for Minton's, and lots of pictures as well. And her book's not that old, so unless there've been recent books on Minton's, I think that's probably the best place to look. I mean, we've been quite interested. When we went to the Met a couple of days ago, in the collections there is this Minton faux Chinese porcelain, or imitation of a Chinese porcelain object, which looks exactly like the illustrations in Jones's book on Chinese ornament. And we thought, gosh, Minton's are churning out almost facsimiles of items in Alfred's collection. How extraordinary! But I don't know that anybody has written that up. Wait a minute. Oh no, it's Lepec, isn't it? I was thinking of Martin's article. No, I think start with Carol Flores. It's the best I can do. I'm sorry.
And just one more thing. It's interesting now that I'm not a scholar, but I'm aware of a lot of revelations of how so many things that were considered specifically Western European or classical, actually their origin is Islamic or Oriental, Asian. you know, the whole circle in the square. That
You would be at one with Owen Jones in
Yeah.
taking that line. He was, I mean, he more or less said, you know, everything comes back to Islam. I mean, it was fairly extraordinary position.
Apropos the Chinese things, were they all disposed of in bulk in certain sales?
Chinese porcelain, no. They still
Not just porcelain, but there were obviously other things. Like there was cloisonné, yeah.
I mean, the picture on the front cover, which is used as the sort of poster for this talk, shows Alfred Morrison next to these amazing crane
That's right.
scepters, which were from the Summer Palace. They're about this tall.
Right.
Sold back to a Chinese collector in about 2010 for I think £13 million. Some of the pots, there was one I think that I showed. I didn't say it, but it was sold recently for £5 million. I mean, these are.
Yes, the family still have some.
So the family still owns a lot of them.
They're not a lot, no. I mean, what was interesting, they were put in the heirlooms list, so they weren't flogged off by label.
Well,
And they began to be sold off in the 1970s and revealed in that way what the Morrisons had. But the big sales of Chinese porcelain and enamel cloisonné is 2004 and then 2010. And that's when they suddenly hit these enormous prices. And Chinese collectors came to London and also Hong Kong to buy back the pieces.
were they primarily 19th century things?
Yeah, no, I'm not an expert. 18th century.
The Qianlong, they were Qianlong. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to bring us to a close, but I feel so grateful that you welcomed us to your kitchen table and shared your research. Please, first, I want to make sure you see on your way out that there are little flyers in case you do want to purchase the book or explore the digital version, which sounds amazing. But for now, please join me in thanking Carolyn and Neil.